Welcome. Grab your favorite morning beverage and join us for Morning Cannolis with Jim Santelle.
You don't know me, but I'm your brother.
Sampling the news desserts of the week, here is your host, Jim Santelle.
Good morning. It is Saturday, January 20th, 2024, and my name is Jim Santelle. I'm your host for this hour and next hour as well on this, our weekly Saturday morning review, our analysis, and our discussion with you of some of those most significant and impactful news events, developments in the areas of law and government and the aspiration for justice. I am honored and I am delighted that you've selected to join me and my wonderful producers, Anya and Johnny, again this morning for this all-important discussion of things that are significant in our lives, important to our localities, our state, our nation, and our world. This is our 81st broadcast on the broadcast stations of civic media throughout the state of Wisconsin. We're coming to you this morning from the WAUK radio station in beautiful downtown Waukesha, but delighted once again to invite to our discussion this morning listeners, callers, folks who are interested in our subject matter from all across the state. And as always, you can do that very simply by sending to me, to Anya, to Johnny, your questions, your inquiries, and yes, even your comments on some of our syllabus items. Call us at 844-967-2789. That phone number once again, 844-967-2789. Or you can also go online. Go online to Civic Media. Find your particular broadcast station. Find the folder that says Morning Cannoli and write to us. Send us an electronic inquiry, a question, a comment, and we will include that in our all-important discussion this morning. Now, as always, this morning, January 20th of 2024, we ask three principal key questions. We ask what happened. We focus a lot here on what we know. What are the facts, whatever those may be? Second, why are those kinds of things important? Why are we talking about those things on our Saturday morning broadcast? Why are they relevant? Why are they material to your understanding of the world in which we all live together? Why are they significant? And finally, in many instances, what should we do about those things? Not how we should think about them. We don't dictate that in America. We do have a First Amendment that enables all of us to express our views in ways that are consistent with our reasonable and rational perspectives on things. But we do, in fact, identify the ways in which we can respond thoughtfully, meaningfully, purposefully to those things that are happening in our world. And so we also ask those questions about what should we do in response to the things that have happened, why are they important, and what actions, responses, reactions, and answers should we pursue in response to those things that are happening in our world. Our syllabus today comes to you exactly 1 year before we inaugurate another president. Almost certainly, not for absolute certainty, but almost certainly, we're going to be inaugurating 1 year from today an individual who has previously served in the capacity as our chief executive under the Constitution of the United States of America. It looks right now, not for certain, but looks right now as if the candidates for the presidency in this calendar year, 2024, we're all going to the polls in Wisconsin 4 different times, but especially in November of this year, 2 candidates likely before you, the voters, to be elected to the presidency of the United States of America. Either Joseph Biden, the president incumbent of that all-important position, or Donald Trump, the previous incumbent of that high position in our elected office in the federal government. So we will be thoughtfully focusing on a lot of that today as we pursue what is, as always, our ambitious but our achievable agenda this morning, involving you again with questions and inquiries that you may have, hopefully along the way, informative and maybe even inspiring as you pursue your lives today and throughout the coming week and month and year. What is that syllabus this morning all about? We're going to be spending some time on what I regard as 2 of the key news stories of just this past week. One of them has to do with this major announcement from the Attorney General of the United States of America about the results of a months-long investigation conducted by the United States Department of Justice into the horrific shooting at Uvalde, Texas. We're going to talk about what happened there way back on May 24th of 2022. And significantly, we're going to talk about the findings coming out of a special focused inquiry pursued by the Department of Justice into that horrific shooting, taking the lives of many people in that school, and also compromising the safety and security of the community generally. Lessons learned, a scathing report from the U.S. Department of Justice, and in particular the COPS office there, which we'll talk about more, providing some information not only about what happened, but about the ways that things went wrong in Uvalde, both in terms of responding to the horrific shooting that was going on, but also in the aftermath of that. We're going to talk about that and analyze some of the lessons learned so we can think about the role, once again, of the rule of law in our nation, the pursuit of justice, and what government is involved, the United States government involved in these kinds of things to address the recent events in our nation's history. Second, we're going to spend some time talking about a major Supreme Court case that was decided, actually going to be decided in June of this coming year, but was argued this past Wednesday before the 9 justices of the Supreme Court. A case that's going to affect the way in which our federal agencies work in the future. We have talked a lot about this major case in past broadcasts here called Relentless or Loberbright Enterprises versus Raimondo. Raimondo is the way that I have been referring to this case. We're going to chat about why this oral argument was not only so important this past Wednesday, but we're going to try to read the tea leaves coming out of that oral argument, give you some sense about what the Supreme Court may in fact do in June of this coming year as it resolves an all-important issue about the relationship between federal courts and the deference that is properly given to our federal agencies, the experts, the people who know what they're doing, know what they're talking about inside those agency environments. A case involving a Chevron doctrine, Chevron. We're going to talk a lot about that this morning. And then since we're going to be chatting about the Supreme Court, also looking at other things that happened in our high court just this past week, the brief filed by Donald Trump, one of the candidates for the presidency, arguing that he should in fact be on the ballot in Colorado. That brief now filed with the U.S. Supreme Court, anticipating a prompt decision by that court after there's more briefing and perhaps even oral argument coming up sometime soon. We're going to talk about also a significant thing that happened in Maine of this past week, again involving a court there that put on hold the decision to keep Donald Trump off the ballot in the state of Maine. I'm going to talk also a little bit more about some other January 6th related matters. We're going to talk about one of the January 6th defendants from time to time on this broadcast. We review one of the sentencings that has been undertaken by a federal district court judge in the District of Columbia, imposing a sentence on one of the many, many thousands of people who were involved in the attack on the Capitol, now numbering about 1,200 people convicted, charged by the U.S. Department of Justice for involvement in that. We're going to talk about that. We're going to talk about something coming out of New Mexico. The Attorney General are making a decision about a fake elector prosecution, the possibility of that, and the decision that he made not to pursue that. The reason why that's important for all of us, including right here in the state of Wisconsin, when we think about that fake elector issue that we have likewise discussed a lot on this particular broadcast. Then, in connection with other matters on our docket this morning, also going to chat about the continuing litigation in a New York federal court. This is the defamation case brought by writer E. Jean Carroll against the former president, Donald Trump. I'm going to talk about what happened in the courtroom just this past week, a trial that continues on Monday of this week, presumably headed toward a jury decision sometime soon on the second portion of defamation claims brought by E. Jean Carroll based upon what the former president said when he was in the presidency, when he was our chief executive coming out of the Oval Office. What did he say at that time that prompted this particular lawsuit? How does it relate to the previous lawsuits? And what can we expect coming out of the federal district court there in Manhattan with respect to these civil charges brought by E. Jean Carroll against Donald Trump. Then we're also going to talk about some other cases around the country. We're going to go to Texas. We're going to go to the state of Texas to talk in particular about a decision made there by the governor and the legislature, which we have previously discussed, and the response once again by the U.S. Department of Justice, what in the area of immigration enforcement, as we've talked a lot on this broadcast, under our Constitution, immigration, one of those fairly few issues in the experience of Americans that is exclusively delegated for policy development, administration, law enforcement oversight to what? To the federal government, not to the states, for a variety of very good reasons. Our founding fathers said when it comes to immigration issues and matters related to border security, those things need to be in the hands of a national federal government as opposed to a state government. I'm going to talk again about what Governor Greg Abbott did a number of weeks ago, signing legislation that empowers state authorities to begin to enforce the immigration laws there in the state of Texas. And the response, once again, by the U.S. Department of Justice just this past week, bringing a lawsuit to challenge the passage by the Texas legislature, the signature on that legislature by the legislation by the governor to require the enforcement by state authorities of immigration issues. We're going to chat about all of that on our very, very chock full of significant information, news, insight, all in the area of rule of law and government and the aspiration for justice in America. And as always, we're taking your phone calls at 844-967-2789 or go into the Civic Media app, find your particular broadcast station, send Anya, send Johnny, send me a comment, a question, an inquiry about one or more of these topics as we launch into them right now. I promised before that we would begin our broadcast with a discussion of what happened in Uvalde, Texas. And yes, that's indeed where we're going to begin our discussion this morning. We're going to spend some time right after this first break telling you again what happened way back in May of 2022, and then reviewing this very significant, huge report issued by the Department of Justice, extremely critical of law enforcement. We'll tell you more about what that all means and why it's important to you here on our Saturday morning broadcast. Stay with us for that discussion.
Telling me the things you're gonna do for me. I ain't blind and I don't like what I think I see. Taking it to the street. Taking it to the street. Taking it to the street. No more Negro. Taking it to the street.
Civic Media app.
This is the Shaw WAUK.
We are back this morning. Thank you once again for joining me on our Saturday morning broadcast, talking about all things law and justice and the aspiration for justice in America. Beginning with our discussion this morning of this major report, a major report issued by the Attorney General and the U.S. Department of Justice in the wake of the horrific shooting in Uvalde, Texas, way back in May of 2022. A finding of unimaginable failure. That's the description in this report in the police response to the shooting in Uvalde way back in May of 2022. An unimaginable failure of law enforcement to respond as it should. How do we get there? How do we get that result based upon what the Department of Justice has found? Let's go back and recall what happened on that day. Recall that a lot of reporting about this, but again, confirmed in this hundreds-page report issued just on Thursday of this past week. A lot of information about law enforcement focusing on it, but also describing along the way what happened on that day. Significant signs that the Uvalde killer, and not described by name, not identified by name in this report, but he was plainly a troubled and a bullied loner. He was nicknamed actually the school shooter by some acquaintances even before the shooting itself happened. Dropped out of high school. He used money apparently to from his fast food jobs to buy an arsenal of two, yes, that's right, semi-automatic weapons. How many times have we heard that? He also used conversion devices used to increase the rates of fire. All those kinds of things that have been the subject of what? Of legislation, proposed legislation, state and federal, to stop this horrific problem that we have with semi-automatic and automatic weapons in America, and also purchased thousands of rounds of ammunition. In the days leading up to the shooting, he made menacing remarks to coworkers at the fast food job that he was working at. He talked openly about being suicidally depressed, and all of this, once again, in the report that anticipated the findings by the Department of Justice with respect to law enforcement. At 11:10 a.m. on May 24th, 2022, he shot his grandmother in the face. And then he texted a 15-year-old girl in Germany with whom he was engaged in some conversation online that he planned to shoot up an elementary school. And sure enough, he drove his pickup truck to the nearby school there. He ditched in a fence. He dipped in a ditch. He hopped a fence. He entered the school building through an unlocked door. You recall all this information from the reporting at the time, and began firing indiscriminately at young students who were gathered in a pair of connected classrooms there. Now, this is where it becomes very significant. The reason for bringing all this back to your attention is because this is the focus of the review of the actions of law enforcement. What happened next? Law enforcement officers arrived fairly quickly, almost immediately on the scene, and approached those classrooms. Again, according to this report issued by the Attorney General, the shooter fired at them, and they retreated down an adjacent hallway. Then, and here's the key, for more than an hour or so, local, state, and federal officials, including agents from the U.S. Border Patrol, discussed how to deal with that situation. And they made the fateful, again, now condemned decision to classify this incident, what had been happening up to that point already, as a barricaded standoff that required negotiation rather than an active shooter scenario. And as we know, in the wake of many other shootings, including Columbine from way back when, that classification as an active shooter situation, that scenario should have compelled law enforcement to engage in an immediate and aggressive response. You go in. The lessons from recent years, as horrific as they are, horrific that we should have lessons from these kinds of mass shootings, but nonetheless is that law enforcement confronting active shooter situations, you go in. That has been the training, that has been the rule, that has been the law enforcement practice in every place that has confronted this up to now. Apparently not in Uvalde. Justice Department officials initially said that their investigation, which was led by this thing called the Community-Oriented Policing Office, the COPS office that I made a reference to before, would take a long time to complete. And indeed it did. Several months, just under 2 years actually, to complete. And what is it? What is it specifically in the wake of all of that the Attorney General announced just on Thursday of this past year? Here it is. A near total breakdown in policing protocols that hindered this response to this horrific shooting that I've just described in Uvalde, Texas. 21 people dead. The refusal, the report says, to rapidly confront the killer needlessly cost lives, and the Department of Justice confirms that in its report, and the Attorney General says as much as well in his comments in Uvalde, along with other representatives of the U.S. Department of Justice, including the Associate Attorney General, her name, of course, responsible for the oversight of this is Vanita Gupta. Ms. Gupta, a wonderful, like the Attorney General, a wonderful public servant. I had the great privilege of working with her when I was at the Department of Justice, not only as a U.S. attorney, but also prior to that time. Vanita Gupta is also a part of this community. She has come to Wisconsin. She came to Oak Creek and was a part of the remembrance of the shooting at Oak Creek, and delighted, even in the midst of that great sorrow, to have her presence. She repeated that this past week, along with the Attorney General, as the two of them appeared in Uvalde, met with the families in advance of their public announcements, and then made some public announcements about exactly what this report said. Described this event as a cascading failure of leadership, decision-making, tactics, policy, and training, all of that based upon this delayed and passive law enforcement response that allowed this 18-year-old gunman with this semi-automatic weapon to remain inside this pair of connected fourth grade classrooms that I described before. The place, Robb Elementary School. That went on for 77 minutes before he was confronted and killed. The most significant failure, this investigation concluded, was this decision by local police officers to classify the incident as a barricaded standoff. This as a part of the findings of this report, rather than classifying as an active shooter situation, which again, what is the result of doing that? Identifying that and saying, we need to respond quickly. We need to go in. This is not a situation where we wait, where we can negotiate. And that's apparently exactly what the Uvalde law enforcement authorities did at the time, requiring instead instant and aggressive action, not done at the time. Significantly, almost all of the officials in charge of that fateful decision that day have already either been fired or they have retired from public service. So what did Attorney General Merrick Garland, speaking to the residents of Uvalde, speaking to the families, say about all this? He said the officers who converged on the school within minutes of the attack intended to storm the classroom. That was their intent, but were told to stand down. And yes, indeed, the Attorney General went on to say this, not only in response to media inquiries, but also as a part of the reporting that Vanita Gupta and he did just this past week. He said this. He says lives would have been saved and people would have survived if officers had acted quickly to confront that government. He related a timeline of some critical moments when officers were outside the classrooms that could have halted the rampage, and they did not take action. The main takeaway from this report, the investigation, we're going to talk more about that right after this break, and then draw some conclusions from this. Why is this important? Why is this a rule of law issue? And what happens next, not only in Uvalde, but around our nation? Stay with us for that continuing discussion. We are back here in our Saturday morning broadcast talking once again about this major report issued by the U.S. Department of Justice this past week, reviewing the horrific shooting and even more compelling for our present understanding, as horrific, as significant as the loss of life there in Uvalde was and remains. Important to understand what happened with law enforcement and to learn to try to remedy these problems in the future. The Department of Justice issuing this report, giving some instruction about what should have happened and what can in fact be done in the future to remedy these situations so the horrific losses suffered by communities like Uvalde don't happen again. So the main takeaway, again, as Merrick Garland said just this past week, that officers who respond to an active shooting scene need to, as he said, immediately enter the room to stop the shooter with whatever weapons and tools the officers have with them. Whatever weapons, you do not, in fact, wait. And that's one of the big takeaways from this report. It is not simply telling the community what happened. We have seen already in the media the stories, the reporting, the compelling comments made by members of the families of people lost and injured during the course of this horrific shooting, talking about their perspectives on this and saying, you know what, as significant it is that the Department of Justice does this, what we need to ensure is that in the future there are lessons learned or lessons not only revisited but reaffirmed for law enforcement. And that's exactly one of the reasons why we're talking about it here on this Saturday morning broadcast. Along the way, of course, it's important to identify those particular people who may have been involved in not responding as they should. Initially, blame for the delayed police confrontation shifted, if you will. In the immediate aftermath, there was some focus upon the state police chief. His name is Stephen McGraw. And after that, the local police chief, Pete Arredondo, was also implicated, if you will, in failing to address in a thoughtful and purposeful way this horrific event as it played out. Turned out afterwards, as the report goes on to confirm, that state police officers were also among those who failed to actively confront the gunman. A lot of responsibility described in this report. And focusing once again on the decision by Pete Arredondo and others to delay going in. A 600-page report compiled from 260 interviews, 14,000 documents, videos, probably the most comprehensive assessment to date of a killing spree that helped spur the passage of some new federal gun control legislation. We know about that from the actions by our chief executive and, yes, by the Congress. Not enough plainly. And this report also continuing to underscore the need for the Congress and our legislatures around our country, including right here in the state of Wisconsin, to address the automatic, semi-automatic weapon problem that we do, in fact, have. The reality of this was perhaps best summarized by Vanita Gupta, who said, again, the Associate Attorney General responsible for the Civil Rights Division, its special litigation section inside the Civil Rights Division, inside the U.S. Department of Justice. She said this was an unimaginable failure. The delay, she said, in confronting the gunman meant that the 19 children and 2 teachers who were fatally shot did not receive immediate medical care. 1 teacher and at least 1 student who were found seriously wounded but alive in the classrooms later died while being transported to hospitals. 17 others were injured, and they, in fact, survived. That question about what could have happened, again, addressed in many ways by the Attorney General and by Associate Attorney General Vanita Gupta just this past Thursday. Now, what do we take away from this? Well, in addition to identifying the people who made these horrific decisions or non-decisions to go in, reaffirming what we'll call the Columbine rule, which is when you have an active shooter, law enforcement obliged with, as the Attorney General said, with whatever tools you have, you go in. You do not wait. This is not a negotiation situation. Reaffirming that fundamental principle that we have known since 1999. 1999, a lot of focus here upon failure to train, failure to report, failure to properly understand what one does in these situations. So the Department of Justice offering some very detailed recommendations, not only to the Uvalde law enforcement, Texas law enforcement, frankly, law enforcement throughout the nation once again, learning from what happened to that community, the families who lost people in that shooting. Those recommendations, including adherence to guidelines, these fundamental post-Columbine guidelines that call for neutralizing a gunman immediately in any situation where this active shooter situation is present and identified. So the officers have to be prepared to respond in a situation, even to risk their own lives for the protection of their communities. And that's the other big takeaway, which we've talked a lot about on this broadcast, the concept that public service is not easy. Public service, especially law enforcement, is not an easy thing to do. But it's also a critical part of our general commitment to the safety and security. And those people who deserve our respect and our admiration for taking on these jobs also carry with it a tremendous responsibility on our behalf to act in ways that are responsible. It is this dual commission to not only adopt and embrace the service feature that they provide, but also to do it with competence and to do it consistent with understood policies and practices. Officers, the Department of Justice said, have to be prepared under these circumstances based upon that dual commission to risk their lives for the protection of the people they serve, the communities like Uvalde in which they are operating. Even if they have inadequate firepower and are armed only with some standard issue handguns to confront a gunman with a much more powerful weapon. The report put some blame on state officials who said it had also shown no urgency about setting up an effective command structure at the scene of the shooting. And as I said, also a huge amount of focus upon failures to properly train, failures to properly understand what to do, and even to put together the kinds of things that we should anticipate in these critical incidents. Now, this report, once again, coming out of the Department of Justice, called a critical incident review inside the Civil Rights Division, initiated about 20 months ago by the request of the mayor there. And significantly, again, what happens in the wake of this? Well, the Attorney General said that the report itself is in many ways the significant response to this horrific shooting, but more has to happen. And while the Department of Justice role in providing this kind of interactive and, if you will, invasive instruction that now needs to take place in any law enforcement situation that is not properly trained, not properly armed with the things that needs to do, both in terms of operational styles and mechanisms, but also equipment. Department of Justice has mechanisms for doing that, and plenty will follow up based upon the findings of this report. The other question, of course, is what about some more responsibility for those people who failed, as this report indicated, failed to live up to that commitment to service that I just talked about? Well, the local district attorney, her name is Christina Mitchell, has been conducting an investigation to determine whether any state criminal charges should be brought. And when the Attorney General and the Associate Attorney General, Vinita Gupta, met on Wednesday with the families, some of them specifically asked, of course, that that kind of criminal prosecution be pursued. We will anticipate further reporting, plainly from the DA there, as she continues to investigate this matter and follows up on it. Again, the important rule of law takeaways, the importance of police in our society to ensure our safety and security, and along with that, the requirement and the expectation, the legitimate expectation that all of us as citizens of our nation, of our state, and of our localities have. It is not too much to say, even though, yes, indeed, public service, law enforcement is not easy, still, coming with that great responsibility is the obligation to do it in a way that is not only competent, but is up to date in terms of policy and practice, training, and ensuring that when these things happen, as they will regrettably continue to do in America, that our law enforcement is ready to go. A significant report for all of us to understand. It is 600 pages long. It is a lot to consume, but very important in the life of our nation. A significant report coming out of the U.S. Department of Justice this past week from the pen of the Attorney General, from the pen of the Associate Attorney General, from the COPS Office, telling us all about who we are and about, yes, the importance of living in a nation where our government can, in fact, admit and identify errors. That is something that, even in the midst of this horrific situation, the compelling need to remedy what happened in Uvalde, that is also an important rule of law takeaway that we do in fact identify and talk about our errors so that we can correct them and make certain that in the future, to the best we can, they do not happen again. Uvalde, Texas, an unimaginable failure, according to the Department of Justice, this past week. Let's talk about the other big story coming out, this time of Washington, D.C. That story, of course, coming out of Uvalde, Texas, but out of a Department of Justice entity again, the COPS Office, the Civil Rights Division, located at Main Justice in Washington, D.C. Right down the street, right down Pennsylvania Avenue on Capitol Hill is what I suspect that many, if not all of you, have visited there in Washington, D.C., is the site since 1935 of our U.S. Supreme Court, the highest court in our land. We know some things about the Supreme Court. We talk a lot about it on this show. I'm going to spend some time this morning in the remaining moments of this hour and next talking about a major Supreme Court case that was argued before the 9 justices just this past Wednesday. Before we do that, let's talk about where the Supreme Court is today, right now, 4 months into the 2023-2024 term, a term, as you know, that begins on the first Monday in October and finishes on September 30th of the following year, even though most of the major decisions are going to start being issued in March, April, and especially May and June of every year. That's when we anticipate the big cases being issued. And indeed, the case we're going to be talking about in principal focus this morning, this Raimondo case, also known as the Relentless case, actually 2 cases brought together for consideration by the Supreme Court just this past week, a part of 57 cases to this morning. 57 cases in which the Supreme Court has already said, we will take a look at these, we will review them. We have talked about a lot of those. Why? Because they fall in this category of guns. A lot of focus, Supreme Court cases pending right now about various aspects of the firearms issue in America. A lot of cases involving social media and the interaction, once again, between social media providers and our government. A great number of cases involving Donald Trump And we'll chat a little bit about some of those as well, including a major brief that the Trump attorneys filed with the Supreme Court just this past week. But then also, we have spent a lot of time talking about these agency cases among the 57 that the Supreme Court has already indicated it will take and it will review, anticipating that in the end the Supreme Court will probably decide somewhere between 60 and maybe even 70 cases. In recent years, it's been about 62 or so. Not too long ago, it's been in the 70s or so. So maybe adding about another 10, maybe 15 cases yet to its docket in that connection. Two of them from the Seventh Circuit, one of them involving something called the Armed Career Criminal Act, a sentencing issue to be decided, and then a second criminal case also coming out of our own Seventh Circuit, which again is Wisconsin and Indiana, Illinois. Those are the three states, those three states that have district courts together combined to make a circuit court. From the Seventh Circuit, these two cases, one involving the Armed Career Criminal Act, the other involving something called gratuities payments, also a criminal case and interpreting a section of the Federal Criminal Code. Those two among the 57 already on the docket of the Supreme Court. Just to give you some sense of where these cases are otherwise coming from, highest number coming from the Fifth Circuit. Those are the states principally directly in the south of us, along the south border. A Second Circuit has 7 cases. That's basically New York and other states in that area. The Ninth Circuit has 8 cases pending. And yes, indeed, under the jurisdiction of the Supreme Court, 5 cases coming out of states and district courts as well. When we come back, we'll tell you about another one of the oral arguments among the 20 that have already been conducted on some of those cases as we continue our Saturday morning discussion of the United States Supreme Court and things before it. Stay with us for that second hour of our discussion this morning on our Saturday morning broadcast.
The Shaw, WAUK.
I'm Terry.
And we are back for our continuing discussion this morning of all things related to justice, the delivery of justice, the administration of justice, rule of law, and government in America. Thank you for your continuing involvement in our discussion this morning. As always, taking your phone calls at 844-967, or you can drop a comment into the Civic Media website. Go online and send us your inquiry, your question as well. And Anya and Johnny and I will be delighted to entertain those inquiries from you. Talking now once again about the United States Supreme Court. And among the 20 oral arguments it conducted in 2023, the 9 so far in 2024, among those 29 altogether that our United States Supreme Court has conducted so far, one of just this past week. As an important footnote, 11 more are scheduled in February, and 16 cases among that 57 yet to be scheduled, including a major case involving the interpretation of the very statute under which the former President Donald Trump has been indicted, at least in part. Whether the indictment, whether the charges under that particular statute are legitimate. Not addressing so much the specific indictment against him. Another case called Fisher, in which the defendant raises the issue of the legitimacy of using a particular federal statute to charge as it was against him. Also charged in the same way against the president. We'll talk more about that Fisher case down the road as well. But this morning, I want to spend some time talking about a civil case pending in front of the United States Department of Justice, having to do with what we've chatted about before, this thing called the Chevron Doctrine. The Chevron Doctrine, Chevron, comes from a case called Chevron versus Natural Resources Defense Council. 1984 is the time that this decision was made. It is one of the most often cited, invoked cases in American law, and that's what makes this pendency of this case before the Supreme Court all the more important, significant. As I have indicated before, as important as those cases in all the other areas are, including guns and social media and certainly the Trump matters as well, and a myriad of other criminal and civil matters pending before the Supreme Court, I would offer that this particular case, or these two cases combined, if you will, are among, if not at the top of the list, most important cases pending in the Supreme Court this term because of the way that this Chevron doctrine and the possibility of getting rid of it after 40 years of precedent could impact the way in which you interact with federal agencies, that I interact with federal agencies, that we understand the relationship between federal agencies and the courts, and what experts, the people who know, the people who understand how these matters work inside their areas of expertise, how those things are best administered in our government. Chevron versus Natural Resources Defense Council established this principle in 1984. Said basically this: the judges, federal judges, are obliged to defer, and that's where the deference word comes from, defer to agencies' reasonable and rational interpretations, again, based upon expertise, based upon the fact that they know what they're talking about, of interpretations of statutes that may in fact be incomplete and may in fact be ambiguous. You may say, well, gee, how do you get there? Well, we know that Congress, when it is fully active, does indeed pass legislation. And plainly, legislation is not intended to provide for every single circumstance. That's why you've got a legislative branch that puts those broad principles in place, and you have an executive branch that does what? It executes the law and says this is the way in which we are going to apply the law under our system of a three-part government. The executive branch responsible for identifying people, principally in the civil area, who are experts, who know what they're talking about, developing that expertise in all sorts of areas of labor and commerce and agriculture, of space travel, if you will, of education, of law enforcement, of education, of diplomacy, all kinds of things out there that are important to the administration of our government. And the Chevron doctrine says that when it comes to interpreting statutes that may not have clear direction to the agencies, even the federal courts, about how a particular statute be interpreted in a particular case, the notion is deference. The judges are, if not completely obliged, there is an assumption that they will defer and rely upon the good expertise of people who know what they're talking about. In close cases, and there are some, there are more than a few out there, the views of the agency in the end will take priority. Even if courts might have ruled differently, that's where the deference comes from. That's the reason why this Chevron doctrine is so important. Supporters of the doctrine, of course, say that it allows these specialized agencies to appropriately fill in gaps, right? Those areas where the statutes may in fact be ambiguous, may be incomplete, so that the operation of government can in fact continue. And they also maintain, I think appropriately, that by doing that practice, that is, filling in those gaps, if you will, that's exactly what is contemplated by Congress. Congress establishes, once again, these broad principles and guidelines. The agencies, with their expertise, are the ones who administer it in the specific details of cases before that. Now, opponents to that concept, including very clearly some business groups that have traditionally been hostile to Chevron deference, identify this as sort of overregulation. And they say that the role of courts is, in fact, to rein in some of these agencies. That, again, as we have seen in the present campaigns, this notion of this administrative, sometimes even called a deep administrative state. I assure you it doesn't exist, but nonetheless, that's the language that is used to describe these attacks upon the agencies. And those who are opposed to the Chevron doctrine and want to see it overturned and gotten rid of, they say that's not the executive branch officials, but it is people in the courts who should have free rein to decide these kinds of things. And indeed, it should not be. It should not be civil servants who are responsible, even though they may know what they're talking about with their expertise. They're not the ones who should be making these kinds of things. Others should decide that. They say the agency's interpretations can change with every new administration. Yes, that is true. And that they sometimes put a thumb, if you will, on the scale in favor of government in close cases, even when it is a party to the case. And indeed, Neil Gorsuch has said very, very famously in the past, and once again, just this past week, he says it seems that whenever this particular statute This notion is involved to apply to statutes that is Chevron deference. The government always wins. When we come back, we're going to talk more about these cases, again, identified as Raimondo and Relentless, why they're so important, and what the other justices of the Supreme Court said, reading the tea leaves on whether or not Chevron deference continues into 2024 and beyond. Stay with us for the second hour of our discussion.
Welcome. Grab your favorite morning beverage and join us for Morning Cannolis with Jim Santelle.
You don't know me, but I'm your brother.
Sampling the news desserts of the week, here is your host, Jim Santelle.
And good morning once again. It is Saturday, January 20th, 2024. 1 year out. 1 year out from the day in which we're going to be inaugurating the next president of the United States of America. And we are talking in the last minutes of our first hour and the first minutes of this hour about this major case involving the Chevron doctrine, Chevron deference before the United States Supreme Court just this past Wednesday. As a part of our analysis, our review, our exposition of all things law and government and the aspiration for justice in America here on our Saturday morning broadcast, always inviting your comments and questions at 844-967-2789, and also soliciting and encouraging your questions or inquiries online. Go to Civic Media, find your broadcast station, send us a note. Anya, Johnny, and I will be delighted to receive information and insight and perspective and questions from you as well. Let's get back to our discussion now about the United States Supreme Court. Again, a docket of the Supreme Court approaching very soon. 60 cases, probably going to be something in excess of that by the time the Supreme Court is all done. Oral arguments, 29 so far in this term of the Supreme Court. 11 more scheduled in February, 16 yet to be scheduled. And among those, once again, as we said in our last hour, this discussion just on Wednesday of this major case involving the Chevron doctrine and the future of our federal agencies and how we understand expertise inside our federal agencies. Let's go back and talk about how these cases get before the Supreme Court, what they're all about. They actually involve fishing, believe it or not. The justices, again, considering two cases, two sets of fishermen, one in New Jersey and the other in Rhode Island. Both of them objecting to the maritime agency's interpretation of a 1976 federal law. And what did that federal law say? It requires them to carry observers on board their fishing boats. And those observers oblige, of course, to ensure compliance with federal law in all sorts of areas. The question is whether or not the fishermen themselves are obliged to pay for those observers who are there to gather data to prevent overfishing and otherwise to ensure compliance with federal law. The contested interpretation, which was set out in a 2022 regulation, again adopted by this federal agencies, the experts inside this particular area called the National Marine Fisheries Services, required the fishermen not only to transport those observers, but as I said, also to pay for them at a rate of about $700 a day. So the underlying question is whether or not they should be required to make those payments, and most importantly, whether the decision, the administrative decision by the agency itself, this fishing entity, is legitimate, and whether it should be supported by the federal court, and significantly, whether the federal court and now the Supreme Court should defer to the agency in making its determination about how to interpret this regulation. There can be reasonable people who disagree about this particular case, and I want to underscore that it is important. It is hugely important to fishermen all along our coasts. This is no small matter for them. That's the reason why it is there in the first place. Along the way, they have said not only do we contest the finding of the National Marine Fisheries Service, but we are also maintaining that the very principle adopted by the lower courts that said, you know what? Because the law is unclear here about who pays for this, because it's ambiguous, if you will, we will defer to the agency. We will abide by its expertise and continue to impose this payment obligation upon the fishermen themselves. That's how this is all important, not only inside the fishing industry, again, hugely, dramatically significant, but also for other agencies out there. Because if the United States Supreme Court says, you know what? We're going to get rid of this doctrine that says we should defer to that expertise. This concept, again, coming out of the 1984 case called Chevron. If we get rid of that, basically what it means is that federal judges will be the ones who are substituting their so-called expertise for that of the people we have hired in government to be the experts, to know what they're talking about. I'm going to talk about that very issue right now. Right before the break, I talked about Neil Gorsuch, who said that, automatically, if you invoke this kind of Chevron deference, that means that the agency always wins. Interestingly, his mother, Ann Gorsuch, some of you may remember her. She was then President Reagan's first Environmental Protection Agency administrator. She was somewhat embattled along the way, other stories for another time. But she was in charge of the EPA when this Chevron concept first came about. Now the historical interest here, of course, is that Ann Gorsuch, her son, Neil Gorsuch, now on the Supreme Court, is about to decide whether or not some of the very principles that guided, if you will, agencies, even when his mother was in the EPA, and certainly agencies across the board since that time, Neil Gorsuch, son of Ann Gorsuch, former agency head, now responsible, at least one of 9 people, responsible for deciding whether or not this concept will remain in place. So, Neil Gorsuch plainly among those people, doubtful that he will continue to support it, and indeed an awful lot of indication that others on the Supreme Court, like Sam Alito, like Clarence Thomas, also publicly have cast doubts about the future of this precedent 40 years in the making. Brett Kavanaugh is also viewed as a skeptic. And then we've got the others on the Supreme Court. Let's talk about some of those, and we'll identify based upon the Supreme Court oral argument of just this past Wednesday where the swing votes may come here and whether or not the tea leaves tell us that Chevron deference is about to be discarded by the United States Supreme Court. Well, what happened during the course of the oral argument? Not so much sparring. It was fairly diplomatic and civil. But along the way, the court's so-called 3 liberal members, again, a description that I'm not especially fond of, but it helps to identify, if you will, a general tendency, a general perspective, if you will, from some of the justices in the Supreme Court, just as we sometimes refer to the conservative justices. Again, titles, descriptions, and appellations that don't always apply. Nonetheless, among those 3, all of them took issue with the Gorsuch position, the Thomas position, the Alito position, and Elena Kagan was perhaps among the most articulate among those 3. She said, agencies know things that courts do not. Agencies know things that courts do not, she said, and that's the basis of Chevron. Take away nothing other than that from this conversation this morning. That's it. She went on to say this: discarding the decision would be striking it down and adopting a disruptive mode of operation. She said there have been 70 Supreme Court decisions in the past 40 years relying on Chevron, along with 17,000 cases in our lower courts based upon this notion of relying upon experts, now subject to review and reversal by the Supreme Court. Justice Ketanji Brown Jackson joined in that chorus. She said Congress had given some policy choices to the agencies knowingly and willfully. She said, and my concern is that if we take away something like Chevron, the court will then suddenly become a policy maker. That's Ketanji Brown Jackson talking about this as well. All that very, very significant. Along the way, Justice Kagan also proposed a number of hypothetical questions to the attorneys who are appearing in front of her and the other justices that day. She said, who should decide, for instance, whether a product is a drug or a dietary supplement? The answer, she suggested, was an expert agency. She's making this point that it's inside those agencies where the expertise lives and vests. She's went on to say, it's best to defer to people who do know, who have had long experience on the ground, who have seen thousands of these kinds of situations. And, judges, she said, should know what they don't know. She imagined a new statute, for example, addressing artificial intelligence. She said one that would inevitably, even if Congress passes it, would have gaps in ambiguity. She went on to say this: Congress can hardly see a week in the future with respect to this subject, let alone a year or a decade in the future. She went on to say, Congress knows that this court and lower courts are not competent with respect to deciding all the questions about AI that are going to come up in the future. Now, what did the other justices say? Well, again, it appeared that a majority of the justices might be inclined to get rid of Chevron deference and discard the arguments made by Justices Ketanji Brown Jackson and Sonia Sotomayor and certainly Elena Kagan. The two swing votes, it appears to be, come from the Chief Justice himself and also from our Associate Justice, her name, of course, Amy Coney Barrett. Chief Justice John Roberts asked one of the lawyers for the fishermen, he said, how much of an actual question on the ground is this? He was noting that the Supreme Court had not decided a case using the doctrine in years. And the attorney responded that lower courts continue to decide cases on Chevron, and that is a significant issue. The other significant tea leaf, if you will, coming from Amy Coney Barrett, who again could be the second member of the Supreme Court who votes significantly to continue to adopt and embrace Chevron deference or to reject it. She said, concerned about whether a decision overturning the Chevron deference concept would give rise to countless challenges to earlier rulings under the doctrine. She said this, isn't the door open then for litigants to come back? Isn't this inviting a flood of litigation? And so the question in the end is, we know that there are probably 3 votes to support Chevron deference and to indicate in this particular case that the fishermen probably will lose on the merits, at least as to the Chevron application. The question is, what about John Roberts? What is he going to be thinking about this? And what does Amy Coney Barrett think about this? You add those 2 to the other 3, and you've got 5 votes to keep Chevron deference, keep this appropriate deference in place if they go in the opposite direction, if indeed John Roberts goes in the opposite direction. Either one of those 2, we have a significant change in the rule of law in America. And another decision by the Supreme Court coming up probably in June, the reverse, as we have seen the Supreme Court do before, 40 years of precedent, and change dramatically the ways in which we understand the role of federal agencies and, if you will, compromise the expertise that we call upon civil servants to provide on a regular basis. When we come back, we're going to take some callers about these and other issues. We're delighted to have those callers, those inquiries, those questions. Stay with us as we engage in further discussion about the rule of law in America.
The time will tell. You telling me the things you're gonna do for me.
And we are back talking right now about what's happening before the United States Supreme Court, this major case to be decided in June, in which there certainly is some disagreement among members of the Supreme Court about whether to continue to adopt and embrace and tell lower courts, federal courts, the appellate courts, the district courts, that deference is a good thing. In those instances where the interpretation by the agencies are deemed to be reasonable and rational and premised upon the expertise of those experts inside those agencies. As one commentator on this particular case said, in practical terms, the doctrine promotes a regime where experts do the gap filling. And the alternative proposal, that is, people who are interested in drop kicking Chevron deference, proposed by the alternative to Chevron is to have judges fill that gap. A judge who's not trained as a pilot, I do not want flying my airplane. That was a commentator in the wake of the oral argument by the Supreme Court just this past week. Again, this question about whether or not courts should defer to interpretations by federal agencies when a law is either incomplete, somewhat ambiguous, could have multiple meanings. Who do you go to interpret best on behalf of the people of America how to understand that particular law? We've got callers. Appreciate so much your involvement in our discussion this morning. We're going to go to those right now. We've got from Appleton, Cindy calling in this morning. Cindy, thank you for being a part of our discussion this morning.
The emails I am not an expert on this, but the emails that I am getting from a lot of my groups are saying that to overturn the Chevron doctrine would be bad for environmental protections, would be bad for consumer protections, and I think it's kind of giving the fox the ability to guard the hen house. But I'm thinking, don't the judges kind of confer with experts on the issues now before they make their final votes on stuff? I mean, is this just kind of stirring a pot that doesn't need to be stirred? Or I guess I don't understand what brings us on all of a sudden.
Sure. Absolutely. Cindy, a great point. So thank you so much, because we're talking again about the consequences of this. Let me begin by embracing and emphasizing your first very good point. This is about fishing in the narrow aspect, but you're absolutely right. The application of Chevron crosses every agency in the areas of environment and tax law, consumer issues, as you just indicated, Cindy, all kinds of things out there, agriculture, commerce, labor, all kinds of things that affect our lives on a regular basis, Social Security, tax law, everything out there where you've got people in local offices, even area offices who make decisions based upon the interpretation of laws. And that's the reason why this is so important at a practical level. And then you've got your very important second question that is significant because it helps to reveal what actually happens when judges understand what cases are about and try to figure out what federal laws mean. So you're absolutely right. When I, for example, for many, many years was the chief of a civil division here in eastern Wisconsin, chief of a civil division in western Michigan, when we tried those civil cases on a regular basis, parties, both private and governmental, bring in experts. And you present them to a judge, and you have those experts describe the basis for the decision-making that they have done. And the reason why that happens, of course, is you do want to inform the judges. You want to make certain that they understand basically what is going on with respect to the case. And that's why this is also very important. It is not to say that judges should automatically, as Neil Gorsuch has indicated, should not simply say, well, this is the government's expert and that person should be followed for that reason. But when that expertise is deemed to be reasonable in the court, presented sometimes even in documents by experts, that's when the judges say, you know what? Those people in the agencies who do this on a regular basis, those are the folks to whom I should defer. And even if there's a disagreement about that, there's a contest about that, I shouldn't be the one necessarily substituting my own view for that of the people who actually are responsible for making decisions, and again, who are the experts, who know what they're doing, know what they're talking about. And so while the issue has been out there for a long period of time, it has made our country work. It also, sort of implicit in what you have said, Cindy, ensures there's consistency, right? So that you don't have judges all across the country, each one interpreting a particular statute in a different way. If the agency across the board, across the federal government, every state in Wisconsin and California and South Carolina interprets it the same way, under those circumstances, you get consistency, which is also good for the people of America. So your point is completely well stated and well made. Judges do rely upon experts. The question is once they have made the determination that an expertise in an agency is reasonable and rational, that's when this doctrine says the federal judge should defer to that best, most informed, most expert-based decision of that agency. And so very important points in both areas. Again, I would underscore the first one you made, Cindy, as being especially significant. This is not just about fishing. This can indeed, effective June of this year, change the ways in which federal courts not only act, but in which we understand and have our own federal agencies do their work. Would also contemplate, arguably, as some of the justices indicated just this past Wednesday, an awful lot of contests. Amy Coney Barrett indicating not only cases from the past, cases from the future that are not yet before the courts, all of them coming in and relying not upon the expertise of an agency, but rather upon a federal judge to decide based upon what she or he thinks is best under the circumstances. Important point. Thank you, Cindy, so much for being a part of our discussion this morning. We also have this morning on the phone Mark. Mark, thanks again for calling in this morning. Always glad to have you a part of our discussion.
Yeah, first off, the whole Uvalde situation there just points out the whole tragedy that we have to have this conversation at all. That the open access of some of these firearms to people without proper screening, and that is just remarkable. That I think that Bill Ruger, Ruger Firearms actually said back in the 1980s, no honest man needs more than 10 rounds in his magazine, for the weapons. And of course, that got changed. Now they got 25 rounds, 50 rounds, 100-round magazines. And that this guy was not screened out of the whole process before he got those firearms in the first place. It just staggers the imagination. And in Texas and in other places, they want to loosen up the laws even further as far as how people can get these firearms.
Right. The attorney actually for some of the families actually just articulated precisely the point that you're making, Mark. Said, he did say that the families don't necessarily need a 600-page report to tell them what they already know, which is that we need to get rid of these automatic, semi-automatic weapons. I've commented about it at length in the past. We all know, Mark, you know this. You've commented about it before. They're purposeful in one area, and that is war. They are intended to mow people down. There's no purpose for them in America domestically. They are weapons of destruction, and unfortunate that even these kinds of situations, whether it's Uvalde, whether it's all the other places where mass shootings have taken place, do not prompt legislatures, state legislatures. Our federal legislature, which could take care of these things in a moment, does not prompt them to act. We know it will work. We know that a firearms ban of this sort with respect to semi-automatic and automatic weapons works because it did many years ago. When we come back, we're going to talk more about the Supreme Court. We're also going to talk about other cases pending in the courts, federal and state of our nation. Stay with us for that additional discussion. This morning talking now about the United States Supreme Court. Lots of things going on. Almost 60 cases pending right now before the United States Supreme Court, including this major case involving the future of our administrative agencies and the ways in which federal judges may or may not in the future defer to the expertise. It is what we see in the present campaign, an attack, if you will, upon this thing called the administrative state, the deep administrative state, that actually doesn't exist. Indeed, our agencies, from my experience, 30 years in the federal government, filled with people who are committed not only to their mission, but also understand what they're doing, not perfectly. On a regular basis, government does, in fact, make mistakes. Important to understand that as well, but recognizing that expertise has its place in government and should, in fact, continue to animate what federal judges do, as it has for the last 4 decades. Some of the things happening before the United States Supreme Court just this past week and in another court related to that. We know very well that among those 57 cases or so that the Supreme Court has decided to take on is this challenge by Donald Trump to whether or not he should remain on the ballot, the primary Republican ballot, in the state of Colorado. And you know all about that. Just this past week, Thursday, as a result of the briefing schedule set up by the Supreme Court, Donald Trump's lawyers filed their brief. I'm going to spend just a little bit of time talking about what that brief says. And then when the folks from Colorado who oppose Donald Trump's name on the ballot. When they file their brief, we're going to talk about that brief as well. His main submission in this extraordinary case with the plain potential to alter the course of the presidential election, the main submission by Donald Trump is forceful recitation of more than a half a dozen arguments about why the Colorado Supreme Court was wrong, about it had gone astray in ruling him an insurrectionist who is barred under the Constitution from serving and even appearing on a ballot. The 14th Amendment of the Constitution, as we well know, Section 3 enacted originally to exclude former Confederate officials from serving the federal government, also disqualifies government officials who engaged in insurrection or rebellion from holding office. That's a summary of what the 14th Amendment, Section 3 says. That's the language that's being invoked in Colorado and other places all around the country to determine whether or not Donald Trump, number one, is an insurrectionist, number two, whether the statute, the language, rather, of the constitutional provision as it is established does indeed prohibit him from being on the ballot. So the Supreme Court heard this in writing from Donald Trump this past week. He said, the court should put a swift and decisive end to these ballot disqualification efforts, which threaten to disenfranchise tens of millions of Americans and which promise to unleash chaos and bedlam if other state courts and state officials follow Colorado's lead and exclude the likely Republican presidential nominee from their ballots. Now, this case is going to be argued on an expedited basis on February 8th. Why? Because many states, including Colorado, have votes on March 5th, also known as Super Tuesday. So oral argument coming up before the United States Supreme Court on February 8th. And all of that also going to implicate, obviously, what's going around in the country generally. In this connection, another small but not insignificant footnote to this issue. Maine, as you well know, the Secretary of State there had previously decided that Donald Trump should not appear on the Maine ballot. Her name, Sheena Bellows. The Maine Supreme Court this past week had decided to put that decision on hold. And so basically determined that Sheena Bellows, the Secretary of State there, had been forced under Maine law to issue her decision too quickly without the benefit of the high court's input. In other words, we're going to wait until the Supreme Court decides the Colorado case to determine whether or not the decision by the Secretary of State in Maine on that same basis is legitimate. A significant decision coming out of the Maine Superior Court. The court saying this: the secretary confronted an uncertain legal landscape when she issued her ruling. This from the Justice Michaela Murphy, who's writing on behalf of the court. She wrote a 17-page decision, and she said that should be afforded the opportunity to assess the effect and application to her ruling of whatever the Supreme Court decides, that being, of course, the office of the Secretary of State there. So we'll wait for the Supreme Court to decide on this general issue, presumably very soon, probably long before many of these other cases, also on its docket, are decided in the weeks ahead. We have got a number of additional callers. Delighted to have you with us as a part of the discussion. Let's begin with Kristen. Kristen, thanks so much for calling in this morning. Appreciate it very much.
Good morning, Tim.
Good morning, Kristen. Good to have you with me.
I have a question that that harkens back to the Chevron thing, but
yes,
I'm sure you'll find a way to draw it into all of this. I'm assuming that with all of these cases, there'll be numerous amicus briefs from different sides citing different experts, right? That always happens.
Right.
Some of them seem super shady. Some of them are more legitimate, whatever. So if Chevron falls, does that relegate the agency experts to just using amicus briefs to try to get their points out there, or will they inform the government's position on things?
That is a terrific question. The easy answer, as any lawyer would tell me, is we don't know yet, right? Just because we'll see what the Supreme Court tells us in terms of instruction down the road. But here's the point that you're making, which is very important. we've got a system right now where we know how things work, and we know how judges can, in fact, take information from experts from those agencies. You've got these amicus briefs that you're talking about, Kristen. Friends of the court, amicus, obviously the Latin meaning friend. All these people then writing in. And the significance of that would be, again, depending upon how broadly or narrowly the Supreme Court decides this case in the end, could in fact place all of this on the same plane and say, you know what? The decision, the determination by the agency to which it will still have access. And that's my principal response to you. This is not to say that the agencies will no longer be at the table. Frankly, if I were still litigating on behalf of the government, I would still have an agency official, even in a post-Chevron world, sitting with me at counsel table. The difference would be that deference, that understanding that would otherwise be vested in that person sitting to the left or the right of me would no longer be there. And we'd have to argue much more strenuously, as you say, as all of these experts come in and say what the government is saying is wrong, what we're saying is right, and requiring the federal judge, again, to make the determination, who, as the person I quoted before said, doesn't have that basis to know, I don't want to say who's right or wrong, but doesn't have the fundamental understanding to be able to pick and choose among all of these so-called reports, some of which, as you said, are going to be legitimate, some of which are not. Which one actually makes sense? As I think about your question, Kristen, I think as well about a related situation, which we have talked about at great length, you and I, and in other environments, certainly on this show, other broadcasts, and other community events as well. The case involving mifepristone coming out of the federal district court in Texas. There you've got a situation where the EPA, 25 years of determination that the drug, which is one of the two drugs used in abortion, providing abortion services, is for the most part safe and secure. Findings based upon continued expertise and analysis by medical people, by clinical people, by the chemists out there, by the biologists, all those people who make that decision. And there you've got a situation where the overwhelming number of experts say that, yes, indeed, mifepristone is legitimate. And you've got a few of what you, I think, appropriately described as the less legitimate reports coming in saying, no, there's some real problems with this. And the judge in that situation, again, not really understanding this concept of deference, says, you know what? I'm going to go with those very few minor 1% of the total corpus of expert opinions out there. I believe the ones that are not in the mainstream, and I'm going to find that the EPA experts are wrong. That's the problem. That's the problem with what you've just identified as the result, if you will, of a Chevron deference no longer being a part of our jurisprudence. And we see that already somewhat. It's a little bit different application there. We see that already in that federal judge. And yes, indeed, the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals also basically substituting, although for some different reasons, substituting its decisions for the decisions of people inside the FDA who've looked at this, who've studied this, who know what they're talking about. Getting rid of Chevron deference means, yeah, exactly right, Kristen. Now the judge has in front of her or him a whole great number of expert reports, some of which are off the scale, if you will, of common sense, others of which are right in the middle of common sense, and asking the judge to pick among those who doesn't, as the person I quoted before, doesn't know how to fly the plane. That's not being critical of federal judges, nor is it saying that the government should win in all cases. Understand that there's always this requirement that the judges have got to look and say, well, what's reasonable? Is the expertise being offered by the government expert? Does that make sense kind of generally? Is it rational? You still do that basic threshold analysis. And if you come to the conclusion that this not only sounds right, but makes sense, then that's when you defer. And so again, great comment, Kristen. Appreciate that very, very much. And plainly, we will talk more about how that plays out in the future. Again, I think one of the most important cases for the Supreme Court this term. Tim on the line. We've also got Tim calling in this morning. Tim, we appreciate your comment or question as well.
Okay, on the Chevron thing.
Yes.
You had mentioned that when these inspectors or whatever go on a boat or a ship or whatever, that the fishermen has to pay.
Yes.
Well, who decided that the fisherman has to pay? Why do they have to pay? I guess I don't understand that.
Sure, Tim. And you know what? That is such a good question because that's exactly what the litigation is out about at core. And you know what? That's the kind of thing that, again, reasonable people might differ on, right? And so, again, as I said, not only is your question a good one, but the question as you raise it is precisely what the fishermen are indicating is problematic. And they're saying, you know what? The interpretation given this particular statute that is not clear. Right now, the decision is made by the agency, the people who have worked on this area on a regular basis, who presumably have engaged with on the issue on a regular basis. That issue is precisely what the case is at core about. And the reason why people can differ on that underscores, again, the importance of this Chevron issue generally. Because you can make a different decision on that. You can decide about it. The agency can decide, yes, indeed, you have to make the payment as the fisherman, or you don't have to make the payment as the fisherman. The question is, frankly, even larger than that. It is about whether or not the federal court, in deciding that, will defer to the agency and make that determination. Right now, to answer your question very squarely, it is the agency that has said, yes, indeed, we believe, based upon our interpretation, our years of experience, that this payment should be made. That issue, again, is before the courts, and that substantive issue will be decided one way or the other. The larger issue is, how do you get there? Do you defer to the agency, and in that case, the fishermen lose, or do you drop kick? Do you get rid of Chevron deference and put the federal judge in charge of making that decision at all? Tim, great observation about the practicalities of this particular case. Again, for reference, Raimondo, Loper Bright Enterprises versus Raimondo, and Relentless versus Department of Commerce. Both of those cases now before the Supreme Court, now being drafted, and probably will be issued by the Supreme Court in May, probably even more likely in June of this year, arguably changing the way in which we understand the role of federal agencies in America. Lots going on in front of the United States Supreme Court. Again, the brief being filed by former President Trump, arguing that he should, in fact, appear on the Colorado ballot. And in Maine, the Maine court there saying that the decision by the Secretary of State will stay that until the Supreme Court tells us about what happens in Colorado. All of that related to the Constitution of our nation. When we come back, a little bit more about what's going on in the courts of our nation. Stay with us for that discussion. And we are back on our Saturday morning discussion. We're going to do in the final moments of our time together this Saturday, we sometimes call rule of law snapshots, not to indicate they're not important, but significant things that have happened in recent days, recent weeks, about which we should all be aware. We're talking a lot about, obviously, January 6th insurrection issues this morning, as we have before. From time to time, I do note, among the approximately 1,200 people who have been investigated and charged with offenses related to the attack on the Capitol, the exact number 1,265. Just over a third of those, 440, were charged with assaulting or impeding law enforcement officers. And indeed, just this past week, a Florida man was sentenced to 5 years in prison for assaulting at least 6 police officers during that January 6th riot. His name is Kenneth Bonowitz. He's 58. He's from Pompano Beach. And in court papers, he was described by the government as one of the most violent January 6th rioters. He was sentenced to 36 months of supervised release beyond this 5-year sentence. Fined also $2,000 by Judge Gia Cobb of the U.S. District Court there in Washington, D.C. In a span of 10 seconds, this defendant assaulted 4 officers by shoving, pushing, and punching them, as well as placing one officer in a chokehold and lifting her off the ground. Bonowitz did not stop his attacks until officers sprayed a chemical agent on his face. And after that spraying happened, he was interviewed on videotape and gave an account of what happened. A reporter asked for his name and provenance, and he responded, Ken Bonowitz, Florida. Very proud, apparently, of what he had done that day. Significant to note that these defendants continue to be not only convicted, but also sentenced to significant terms of imprisonment in our federal prisons for these kinds of violent attacks upon our capital. We also know related to January 6th, this continuing focus on false electors, not violent in the physical manner that a Kenneth Bonowitz would be convicted of and sentenced for this past week, but plainly involving in many ways in different states this attempt to try to overturn the vote of the populations in at least 7 states where the votes were contested. We know already when it comes to these fake electors who put together various forms of representations that they were the proper electors under the Electoral College. We know that in at least 3 states, they have been charged criminally for that conduct. These documents being sent to Washington, D.C. with their intention that they be counted by our Speaker of the House and our Vice President at the time. Did not happen. We know that the count was properly done, but only after our Capitol was attacked. This attempt, again, a part of the omnibus attempt to overthrow the results of the 2020 election. In December, we know a Nevada grand jury indicted 6 people with felony charges of offering these false instruments. They are pending right now. We know in Michigan, the Attorney General also filed felony charges in July of 2023, just last year, against 16 fake electors, one of whom is now cooperating with Michigan authorities. We know, of course, case in Georgia, 3 fake electors have been charged, along with others in this omnibus RICO conspiracy there as well. Well, just recently, the Nevada top prosecutor, the Attorney General there, said this. It's important to understand what's going on. He said that the fake electors in that state will not be charged, but noted this. He said, I'm going to seek changes in Nevada law and process to ensure that in the future, this kind of conduct can be prosecuted. Why? He said, because in the particular documents that the fake electors issued in that particular jurisdiction in New Mexico, unlike the documents in other places, including the state of Wisconsin, that language had the documents had some language, a caveat, if you will, saying that's conditional, and that they were submitted in case only in the event that these electors were later recognized as duly elected qualified electors. Now, we can still argue about whether or not that's proper, but the Attorney General there is saying that the particular fake elector documents there, because they had this conditional language, basically indicate that they were conditional in nature with this caveat and therefore not inclined to charge them under Nevada law with the intent to violate the state law there. A difference from other places like Nevada and in Michigan and in Georgia, in New Mexico, because of the specific facts there, distinguishing from those other charges. In Wisconsin, as I said, the fake electors in our state signed off on documents like those documents in the cases where they have been charged. No such language in those documents coming out of the state of Wisconsin. Fake electors obviously continuing to be a significant portion of this overall look and review and prosecution involving January 6th. Finally, let's talk a little bit more about another major case going ahead. Trial continuing on Monday of this coming week. This is the lawsuit brought by E. Jean Carroll, the writer, principally in New York, but has a national reputation, a national readership out there. And she alleges, and has alleged, both in writing and orally, that in the mid-1990s, Donald Trump sexually assaulted her in an apartment store in Manhattan. And in the wake of that, she wrote about it, she described it, and while the former president was the president, while he was in office, he indicated that she lied about it, that he doesn't know this woman, that she made this all up. And those statements that he made were the basis of an initial lawsuit that she brought, alleging that because of the things that he said, he had basically defamed her. That case, believe it or not, believe it or not, has been stayed while the federal issues are resolved about whether or not Donald Trump was immune from that kind of civil lawsuit, if you will, while he's the president. All of that now resolved. Now going ahead, a second lawsuit going ahead in a federal district court in New York City. The case being tried just this past week. Compelling testimony by E. Jean Carroll herself about what happened. The judge, Lewis Kaplan, also engaging back and forth with Donald Trump from the bench, even as Donald Trump is attending. The jury hearing all of this evidence will, again, in this second trial, now determine the amount of damages that Donald Trump will have to pay for the defamation that's previously been proven. And significantly, the former president indicating that he may well appear once again on Monday as this trial goes ahead and may indeed testify. And when he testifies, of course, in a civil proceeding, he has the right to do that. Doesn't oblige to do it, but has the right to do it, also subject, of course, to cross-examination. We will see. We will see what the jury does in that particular case. E. Jean Carroll seeking at least $10 million in damages for his denials that he sexually assaulted her and engaged in this kind of defamation. We will continue to talk about that and many other cases here in the Saturday morning broadcast. Thank you for joining me on the broadcast stations of Civic Media. Join me every Saturday for this discussion, and have a good week, everybody.